Hi everyone, and welcome back to Transportation Insights. This is the podcast where we dive into the hottest freight market topics, trends and insights impacting the global ocean and air cargo transportation industry.
I'm your host, Peter Sand, Chief Analyst at Xeneta, the world's leading ocean and air freight rate benchmarking and market analytics platform. A platform that is here to transform the shipping and logistics industry for ocean and air. And today, I am absolutely delighted to be joined by Thomas Eskesen. Thomas is the founder of Eskesen Advisory. He did that back in 2015. That he considers his contribution to the world of refrigerated cargo, or you might coin it the cold chain, as it is often referred to that, making sure that everyone are aware that this is a supply chain that must be carefully considered for its temperature control all the time. Prior to setting up Eskesen Advisory, Thomas worked for Maersk Line for 30 years, of which the last 10 years he was the global head of reefer business. Thomas, I hope you're comfortably seated, and I wish you a warm welcome to this podcast. Please allow yourself a few moments to share with the listeners and the audience out there the things that I did not pay attention to in my brief opening. So how would you introduce yourself for those that haven't had the opportunity to get across you in the corridors of shipping for a couple of decades? Please.
Thank you very much, Peter. It's a pleasure to be invited, and it's quite humbling to be allowed to share a couple of war stories from the cold chain and the reefer space. I look forward to that. Just by means of introduction, you're correct. I worked almost 30 years at Maersk. Started as a typical shipping guy that wanted to do something with globalization and see the world. And I got shipped out to Hong Kong as a young man of 23. Stayed there for 6 years. Got married to a girl from India. And then we ended up opening up Maersk China Shipping Agency in the mid-90s.
Cool.
My next door neighbor was a certain Søren Skov. He did slightly better with his career at Maersk than I did. I then continued to the United States for 3 years. We had two daughters born in the US, and then I got back to Copenhagen. Around year 2000, starting up an e-commerce division for Maersk. Basically, it was a blank sheet of paper, trying to figure out what was all this business to business and e-commerce all about. And sometimes I feel a little bit saddened when I read about lack of progress in this space, because it's still the same issues we were trying to address with customers, i.e. visibility and industry standards. At the back of my wall here, I have the patent for Intra, which was part of the work space we had at the time. And then, as you say, in 2005, somebody felt that it was time for a change, combining, you could say, the globalization journey with technology, and put me in charge of the global cold chain business for Maersk. Fast forward, that was a tremendous education for me personally, because Maersk's cold chain business, not only being the biggest in the world, it gave you access to growers and importers all over the world. So part of the job was to travel to India, Latin America, be on boards in Oceania, board of container manufacturing. And then towards the end of my career at Maersk, I was 49 and probably got that classic midlife reflection that maybe it was time to try something else. My dad had worked for Danish Customs for his entire career, for 50 years, and my mom was an entrepreneur and had her own law company. So it felt obvious to give it a shot. No particular playbook really, other than I wanted to get into the advisory and have control of my own time. And 7-8 years later, then we're still here. So obviously somebody is looking for advice at times.
Well done, Thomas, and thanks for bringing us around the globe in a New York minute. That was really some adventure, and I can see not only you conclude yourself, you're still around as the head of Eskesen Advisory, and still being very busy taking care of, well, transportation of cargo from what's the term, from farm to fork. I guess we can all relate to that when we enjoy grapes coming from wherever in the world, when we enjoy lamb, when we enjoy all kinds of refrigerated cargoes that we just take for granted in our lives today. And I must say it also fits very nicely in to the topic for the agenda today, which we formalize as managing the cold chain amidst rapidly changing market condition. I think it's also fair to say that whatever has affected the shippers, BCOs, carriers, and freight forwarders in the dry space have also affected the same in the cold chain space, but in a much different manner. And I think you will most likely touch upon this also when we get into the dialogue here, because up first, if I can just ask of you to set the scene with some overview here, where we can then dive into some of your absolute favorites. I mean, what is the top three most important aspects of global reefer business right now and for the entirety of 2023? I know you will also debate this at TPM 23 by the end of February, but just as a teaser also to that, Thomas, can you set the scene of the three most important aspects of global reefer business right now?
So absolutely, and maybe I just start in a different place first in terms of providing a little bit of context.
Yep.
If we look at global trade, the reefer segment represents 7-8% or so of the volume, and depending on what year we are in, it could be anything from 5% of revenue on the carrier side or 20% of the revenue. So just a little bit of context. And for those who are not in this business on a day-to-day, I just ask you to, in layman's terms, just think about what you put in your refrigerator, what you put in your freezer. These are the kind of products we work with. And it's important to understand that the cold chain is linked. So if we think about how do we get our blueberries into our refrigerator, it starts at a farm somewhere. It could be in Peru, and then there's a lot of handover points from a pack house to a truck to a port, vessels, and then another distribution center, for example, in the US. So there's a lot of things that happens for this to work. And in particular, during COVID, when you say what was the biggest problem with COVID? Well, one very, very big problem was that when you had congestion-related items and things were not moving freely, it was a really, really bad issue if you were trying to buy a bicycle and you had to wait, 2 months or 6 months. But if you were shipping those blueberries or your oranges and they were sitting somewhere waiting, you ended up with either loss of product or dramatically reduced shelf life. So it had a lot of financial implications as well across the entire cold chain. So what are the biggest issues we're dealing with right now? I would still say number one is trying to clean up the mess that happened during COVID. And let me start with the financial money mess. The last couple of years, we've seen dramatic increase in input costs to farmers around the world. So your cost on packaging went up, your cost on fertilizer went up, your cost on electricity went up, your cost on labor went up, and you might even have had labor shortages because of COVID restrictions in certain things. You had disruptions in ports in China and what have you. You had congestions, many places, lack of truck drivers, etc. And last but not least, a dramatic increase in shipping costs on the ocean for growers or shippers of protein. And not all markets were prepared to take that extra hit on the cost side. So you could say the number one thing we are working with people on now is when do things return to normal? And what can I do in the interim? Because some farmers have lost a ton of money in the past couple of years. So we are actually seeing a new customer segment in our advisory business, and that's called the banks. And the banks are calling us to see, to which degree should they continue funding the next batch of fertilizers or packaging material, because they don't see it in the business case from the farmers that it's viable to produce. So fundamentally, we are in a situation where we have moved to a supply crisis, in my view, and maybe a little bit harsh, but I think we will see fairly big shortages of certain products this year at farm side, simply because it's no longer viable to be a farmer.
So a supply crisis, literally supplying the cargoes that will then be refrigerated and transported?
Yes, correct. And because you could say historically, one of the things that people really like about the refrigerated space is that there's been a very strong correlation between population growth and just common sense that man's got to eat. So it has been fairly easy to project, 3 to 5% compound growth. We've all gotten used to that. Based on a demand-driven shipping pattern. Now we should start working much more on the supply side and understand, are we sure actually we can get our grapes from South Africa? Can we get our berries like we're used to, and so on? And obviously both farmers and shipping lines and other intermediates have a huge interest in this value creation, so we don't get into value destruction. I would say the other big piece we are working on is almost trying to explain the bigger context of how is price setting happening in shipping. Most of our customers in the BCO reefer space read the same news as you do, and they probably listen to your broadcast, and they can see that there's downward pressure on the Shanghai Freight Index. And so they see that, largely speaking, the Shanghai Freight Index is back to pre-COVID level. And then they are looking at their transport cost in the Southern Hemisphere, and they have not seen the same correction back to pre-COVID. So for me, there's a lot to explain that, listen, there's a big difference between Shanghai, where you have maybe 20 viable shipping lines and 50 NVOs that can help you. So at any given point, there might be 1,000 moving price points. But if you're shipping from South Africa to the United States, there's a choice of 2 shipping lines. And they are not necessarily reacting the same way as when you have 1,000 price points. So there's a delayed effect. Yeah. East-west is important to nuance a little bit where you're shipping, right? So if you're shipping in the east-west trade and you're shipping a lot of, let's say, pork to China and so on, it's a different dynamics, because there the space is opening up now, congestion is freeing up, and so on. So
I guess there's a lot to take in also, just simply due to the fact that there is huge difference between, say, the dry cargo business and the cold chain business. You mentioned yourself it's no longer relevant only to look at the Shanghai index. You need something which is much more comprehensive, something that can deliver you a much more, a much more enlightened insightful picture of where your goods are moving, and not only the main trades, and take that as a rule of thumb that okay, I used to trade at a multiple to any given index out there. You need to go much more into the details, and then realize that at some point in time there will also be forwarders, and perhaps more importantly the carriers that perhaps run a special business, one that you cannot do without, but where you also need to apply a certain sort of tactics.
I would say the complexity when you deal with Mother Nature in terms of farming, or even Mother Nature in terms of global warming with seafood and overfishing and so on, and you have a lot of quotas on pork and trade barriers. It's extremely complicated, actually. So if you're a retailer sitting in Germany and you're trying to figure out how do I hit the right season so I always get my berries in. So then you have a Moroccan season, or maybe you have a Chilean season, and so on. So you could say, I'm not going to try and simplify a dry supply chain, by no means, because they have many more SKUs to manage. But here you're dealing with a live product, and from where any delay can be absolutely critical to outturn And that's kind of what makes it fun as well, because it's something real. And typically our customers are, second, third generation families that have been in the business for years. But we do see consolidation, and that's probably the third piece I was going to say we spend our time on, and that's the M&A space. There's still a lot of room for consolidation, both on the agricultural side, but certainly also on the asset side. So if you look at the cold storage business at large, there's undercapacity, and we see a lot of old buildings. So there's a lot of interest in either merging or do greenfield projects. And here we see the mom and dads that used to dominate this space are struggling, quite frankly, because building a new modern cold storage facility that is almost self-sufficient on energy with solar, you're looking at possibly $100 million plus capex to get off the ground. And so that's no longer something for the mom and dads to do. So we are very active involved, and my partner in the US is also on the Global Gold Chain Alliance board, and that's becoming an even more important leg in our advisory business.
Oh, that's very cool. I think an already complex business just got a little bit more complex, and I must admit myself, I'm a big fan of the cold chain, and I love just to get a chance to pick your brains on this, because this is also just a constantly moving target, and something that sets itself aside from the dry business, yet it is also affected by what happens in the dry space, because I know from talking to industry people also that the huge amount of blank sailings that we right now see out of Far East, for instance, is definitely also creating some worries on what is a traditional, say, dry backhaul, but a head haul for the cold chain, getting refrigerated cargo out of Europe back into the Far East. What's your word of advice to those shippers that find themselves struggling with cancellations that they can see month ahead? How should they, say, prepare themselves for a year where at least we at Xeneta expect blank sailings to come about at rapid pace?
It's a great point, because often people only sort of have line of sight to what's happening in their geography. So let's say if you're a big protein shipper in Brazil and you're reading about blank sailings out of Asia post Chinese New Year, I think the average person would say, that's none of my business. I don't have to worry about it because I'm in Brazil or I'm in Ecuador. But I think the lessons I've learned over time is that if you have a significant amount of blank sailings, particularly from China, it can have global ripple effects from the standpoint that China is the only place in the world where we manufacture new reefer boxes. It's also typically a surplus area of a lot of imported goods, as China is consuming more and more fresh fruit and vegetables and protein from the world. So if you have limited capacity leaving Asia, in particular Shanghai, Qingdao area, it also means there's limited ability for the shipping lines to move empty reefers back to, you could say, source, and that could be in Oceania, it could be in Brazil. So I would say the best advice is to stay really close to your partners of choice in a particular country, so you at least you get some lead time, because nobody is necessarily safe when you have a lot of blank sailings. We saw that in 2020 when we were supposed to have the TPM, and I was in Long Beach. I was ready to moderate the cold chain debate.
And then it got cancelled.
A lot of people, and then it got cancelled the day before. And what turned out to be sort of a disaster became an advantage, because a lot of shipping executives were also there. And so we ended up having some really good conversations about this very topic. Where there's reefer exports from the US to China is not really high on our agenda right now, because I have a bigger fish to fry, so to speak, just protecting my cost base. So, I mean, good advice can also be, if you have a lot of volume, we still see the need for alternative to containers. So what is called the conventional break bulk sector carries, say, 15% of global reefer trade. So it's a good safety valve. And many of our customers are using that as just a good way to get products to market fast. It may be cheaper, or it may be more expensive, but it's at least you can sleep at night and you know your shelf life will be protected and your price point will be protected.
And speaking of having a carrier of choice, and hopefully also, a producer being a shipper of choice for some of the carriers out there. I mean, perhaps I know you advise also on some, say, contract negotiation tactics. All the insights that you can find in the space coming from you or the Xeneta platform in various forms. How can you make use of all that insights when sitting at the negotiation table and getting just the right deal? I mean, what can you say push? What should you push for, and what may you be unable to pass on?
Exactly. Good question. You could say, let me just clarify. So our advisory space, we chose very early to be experts in something instead of being the jack of all trades. So principally, 95% of what we do is in a cold chain space. In three, if you think about a triangle, we attack it from three angles. One is the cargo side. So we work with the BCOs and the middlemen following the cargo and the innovation around improving shelf life, et cetera, et cetera. Then the other lever is the asset piece of it, where we follow and are advising in ports, in trucks, in cold storage, in container manufacturing, container leasing, and that type of thing, the asset side. And then the third lever is the money side. How do we finance these things? So we use that to sort of our vantage point when we're then advising BCOs, and I would say 4 years ago there was not much need to advise BCOs because largely speaking they were spoiled. They got what they needed. They paid a good premium price, and the shipping lines were very interested in their cargo. But during COVID, because the dry rates exploded and it was hard to move empty reefers around, perhaps understandably, the shipping lines would downplay the reefer cargo and say, I'd rather take the dry cargo, it's easier, and the revenue is paying higher. So fast forward to today, our advice is much more granular based on where which commodity segment they're in. It's big difference. Are you moving, 300 containers of bananas every week, or are you shipping pharma products from, Europe into the US, or are you in the citrus business from Eastern Cape or South Africa, and you're trying to grow business in China? I would say our number one advice is to stay extremely close to the shipping line's headquarters, because there's so much going on now that we can't afford to work with hearsay and local agency, what they hear, because there's a lot of global context in what we do. The innovation will come out of corporate head office. We can see that many shipping lines are interested in growing their portfolio. They're interested in innovating with reefer shippers, and that's better. The closer you are to the headquarters, the better. So we realize that's not for everybody to get access. We help them get access, or we go to all the big trade shows around the world and try to do the matchmaking. And I certainly learned the hard way that every shipping line out there is not Maersk and should not be Maersk. And sometimes it's great to have a background at Maersk. Sometimes it's a huge liability. But it helps us translate customer needs into what's your best partner? What are you looking to do? And we do see significantly different strategies by the, top 5-6 ocean liners that in the reefer space control 80% of all the plugs and the containers. So it's a far more concentrated space. The barriers to entry are huge. We were looking at helping some growers in a market to start a brand new container service. We were being asked to charter the ships or build the ships, find the equipment. And the entry cost in Q3 were about $1 billion.
Well,
it's a big investment. It requires a lot of capabilities to do that. So we are very careful actually who we recommend, because if it does not work, the claim on a blueberry box can be €200,000. So you better be careful. And so running it by spreadsheet, it's not really my cup of tea, to be honest. I think this is still very much a relationship and an innovation business that only comes out through these personal engagements.
So you are ready to spoil the brats once again. I mean, they had a few years out in the cold, in lack of a better term here. But now I guess they are very much looking forward to getting back in front of the fire, feeling the comfortness of the carriers that are ready to embrace their business once again.
For the last couple of years. And I think I wouldn't say it's payback, because as I mentioned, it's not just about the price. It's really about the service and making sure it works. Anybody can sort of throw a low price at somebody, but be careful what you wish for, right? As well. So that's kind of what I love about this business, that it is not just the lowest price that wins. It's much more complicated. It's kind of life or death, really, to protect the cold chain.
It's a very nice way of putting it, and I know, Thomas, innovation of the cold chain logistics is also closer to your heart. And what may the coming years bring about for the shippers that seek, say, improved supply chains and offering from the carriers? What kind of innovation are we looking at right now? I mean, this to me seems like breaking edge technology that you at some point in time seek to transport fresh fish, fresh food, fresh everything around the globe. I mean, what's the next in line for the innovation of the reefer business?
It's a great topic and a big pet product of mine. I think if you look at it from a food waste point of view, you can read various articles from World Bank or Rabobank or others that say we are looking at 30-40% food waste. And then you ask yourself, where is it that happens, right? And nobody's got really legitimate good data. And I think I was guilty myself initially as a shipping executive, where you were like, okay, you try to track and trace where is the container, but God forbid are you going to share with your customer what happens inside the container while your customer, because suppose something went wrong, you could be facing a claim. Thankfully, we have seen quite a lot of development, I would say, in the last decade, which is now being accelerated. So the term smart container is no longer a gimmick, it's reality. I would say all the major shipping lines, more or less, except one or two, have made plans now to get into that. And that I think it becomes a secret sauce for innovation, because now you know what's actually happening in my custody. What could I do if I had smarter packaging? What happens on off power if it's 12 hours off power in Tanjung Pilar Pass, not to pick at Tanjung Pilar Pass, but what happens is that a critical event or not a critical event? But speaking with fact and with data is the only way to improve food waste. So I think we'll see a lot there. We've actually had some good debates at TPM in the past. As you know, we have separate events built around the main floor, and one year we ventured out and said, what can the dry space learn from the cold chain space?
Smart.
Unfortunately, most of the dry customers, I think they misunderstood it, so they didn't really go there to learn from the. So we had a room full of cold chain experts, but for those who are listening in and have time, maybe try and come and listen, be a little bit curious for what can you learn from guys we have there, the people from Del Monte or Fives Fruit here. How are they managing their supply chain? Because if you do that right, you can definitely replicate that into the dry supply chain as well. So I would say on a scale from 1 to 10, we are at maybe 3 or 4 in terms of realizing the potential. And the fact that the carriers have printed a little bit of cash the last 2 years or so. I think there's reasonably high expectations among our BCO customers that some of that will be put back into innovation, and not just more containers, because in fact I think we have enough containers, but having smarter containers and trying to get into the end-to-end cold chain. There's still a lot to be done in a very, very fragmented industry.
So these brand new reefer containers that gets onto the ships in the coming years, and perhaps also in the past few years, are they jam packed with sensors, and is that information passed on from the carrier to the customer just like that?
Yeah, theoretically they have the capability. We think about half of the new built containers have that capability from the factory level now. But that's not the same to assume the carriers are willingly sharing that information with the shippers. There's also a learning process. It comes with a third charge. In some cases they have it, but they want to act on it first and so on. There could be some delays. But fundamentally we are getting there. And that means that you can now start working with, what if I change my packaging? What if if I can see 2 days before arrival that I should rather pull this container than another container? I mean, there's endless opportunities, but it requires a partnership attitude that then drives transparency. If you have a contractual relationship, and that maybe that comes down to contracting strategy, but if you contract as a shipper with your service provider on a monthly or quarterly basis, guess what? You're never going to get the best research or innovation out of it. But if your line of sight is more, let me find 1 or 2 preferred shipping lines or 3PLs, and we do it over a 2-3 year horizon, it's much, much easier to open book and really get to the bottom of the pain points. So go a little bit longer on contracts where you can. Maybe Xeneta can develop that reefer index that I think a lot of us are actually looking for, because if you are a grower in South Africa, and you ship grapes, right? Guess what? You're not necessarily competing with a next door farmer. You may be competing with a farmer in India or Peru at the same time. And if those that can come up with the data that one could link contracting to, I think they have a very nice sweet spot to attack here.
I would love to see that on the Xeneta platform sooner rather than later. I know that we crowdsource data from customers all over the world, and one of the things that we would love to get an even better exposure to is the reefer business. So we can see shippers across the world compare exactly not only how they do with their local competition, but also their global competition as we move forward, because that is definitely also something for consideration, and something, if I may add, for say our final topic here. You touched upon this already to some extent, Thomas, the sustainability, food waste, stuff like that. Often you think of sustainability as lowering your carbon footprint on your transportation on a global scale. Xeneta launched back in November the carbon emission index that allows every shipper to reward the carrier with the lowest carbon footprint on a given number of trades out there. So there are, say, available tools for you to act upon. Thomas, your final thoughts on sustainability. How does that look for the cold chain? Is it all about making smarter storage facilities at the exporting side of business and importing side of business? Is it the actual container? Is it the whole industry of global cold chain logistics that are embracing sustainability? In a few words, if possible.
It's a big challenge for me to stay focused on this, because this is a massive topic. And we could all separate the podcast, because in the fruit and fishing business, this is massive, right? Where you could say it starts a little bit at farm level to have sustainable farming, have sustainable labor practices, having a sustainable financial model that you can actually plant a tree for apples and you start harvesting, say 5-7 years down the road, and that is a sustainable practice also all throughout your supply chain with organic fertilizers and great shipping and all that stuff. So there's a lot there. I think in the near term, next year or two, we'll see in this industry more focus on IMO and the environmental compliance and the shipping, which is fundamentally a good thing overall. Mm-hmm. But a caution, of course, if the tactics to lower or improve your emissions rating on a ship means you have to go, let's say, 2 or 3 knots slower or 10% slower. Of course, for people in this business, they would see a longer transport and less price point, right? And the same thing on packaging. If you can just imagine when all the plastic disappears and so on, there's a reason why people have been using plastic for packaging. If we don't come up with something that is protecting shelf life in the same way, we may be super sustainable, but our yield per acre will be less actually. So it's incredibly complicated. Thankfully, technology is helping a lot, with drones that are helping the farmers to see, how is my harvesting and all that stuff. But it's a massive challenge. But I think actually also here we can learn from the reefer space, right? Smart buildings are much more complicated when you need cooling year round and freezing than a dry dumb building, if you like, right? So a lot of innovation yet to be found.
Thomas, thanks for spilling the beans on all of us, not only me today, but to everyone listening in to the Transportation Insights today, where the cold chain was our absolute focus. Thank you so much, Thomas, for joining me on today's Xeneta Transportation Insights podcast. And to everyone listening in from all over the world, thank you too for joining us today. I hope that you have enjoyed the podcast. Most surely I did. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, review, and recommend us. Please remember also, we'll be back next month with another great and insightful episode of Transportation Insights. Thomas, thank you so much. And to every one of you, thank you so much for your kind attention. See you shortly.
And to everyone listening all over the world, thank you too for your kind attention. I hope that you enjoyed the podcast. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, review, and recommend us. We'll be back next month with a brand new episode.